I opened by admitting something I didn't notice for a long time. I wasn't reckless with money, but I was constantly smoothing things over. Small decisions, tiny upgrades, little, it's fine moments, none of them felt dramatic. I talk about how I used to think living paycheck to paycheck meant being bad with money, missing rent, or blowing a paycheck at a bar. What actually bothered me later was realizing how normal everything looked on the surface. Bills paid, nothing overdue, yet somehow there was never any space. I reflect on how I defended that feeling by calling it adulthood, or just how things are now. The emotional weight comes from realizing how comfortable I became with that explanation, and how little curiosity I had about where the money was actually going. I talk about the habit of treating leftover money as permission instead of information. When there was a few $100s after bills, I saw it as room to breathe, not a signal to pause. I describe how that money slowly disappeared into delivery orders, convenience stops, and small online purchases that felt invisible because they didn't hurt individually. The insight is realizing I never asked what that leftover money was meant to do long term. Emotionally, there's a quiet discomfort in how quickly I normalize spending whatever was left simply because it was there. I reflect on how I framed it as balance when really it was avoidance. Not avoidance of budgeting, but avoidance of asking harder questions about stability and future pressure. I focus on subscriptions that quietly multiplied, streaming services, apps, storage plans, memberships I forgot I signed up for. I mentioned specific numbers, $10 here, $15 there, and how they felt too small to track. The insight comes when I add them up monthly and then yearly, realizing how much of my paycheck was already spoken for before I noticed. Emotionally, it's uncomfortable to admit how many of those subscriptions were tied to convenience or mild boredom. I reflect on telling myself they were harmless because they weren't big-ticket items while ignoring how permanent they quietly became. The section ends with me sitting with the realization that small doesn't mean temporary. I talk about food spending, especially the difference between groceries and everything else. Takeout, coffee runs, gas station snacks. I describe how I justified it as saving time and energy after work. The insight is realizing that I paid for convenience with money I didn't feel, but stress I definitely did. I break down a rough monthly number and how it quietly rivaled other major bills. Emotionally, there's a sense of being tired twice, once from work, once from never seeing the benefit of that spending. I reflect on how I treated food as a reward system without noticing how often I was rewarding myself just for getting through the day. I focus on the habit of upgrading small things early. New phone plans, slightly better cars, nicer apartments than strictly necessary. Not luxury, just a little better. I explain how each upgrade came with a monthly cost that felt manageable alone. The insight comes when I notice how stacked upgrades quietly ate future flexibility. Emotionally, there's discomfort in admitting that many of those upgrades weren't about need, but about wanting life to feel smoother. I reflect on how I confused comfort with progress and how hard it is to downgrade once something becomes normal. I talk about minimum payments and how calming they felt. Credit cards, buy now, pay later plans, financing. I mention exact minimum numbers and how they tricked my brain into thinking things were under control. The insight is realizing how minimums stretch time, not solve problems. Emotionally, there's a moment where I admit I didn't want to see the full balance because it would force a different feeling. I reflect on how I told myself I was being responsible just by staying current, without questioning how long current would last. I focus on how I separated spending from consequences by time. Buying now, dealing with it later. I describe how future me always felt abstract, almost like a different person. The insight comes when I connect that habit to why progress always felt delayed. Emotionally, there's a quiet shame in realizing how often I pushed responsibility forward without acknowledging it. I reflect on how easy it is to feel responsible in the moment while quietly borrowing from the future. I talk about gas, commuting, and the invisible cost of getting through the week. Small fill-ups, extra trips, idling time. I mention a rough monthly gas total and how it surprised me when I finally noticed. The insight is realizing how routine costs fade into the background until they're examined. Emotionally, there's frustration in how unavoidable these costs felt. how little effort I made to understand them. I reflect on how resignation can look like acceptance, even when it's just giving up attention. I focus on the habit of rounding down costs in my head, treating $47 as $40 or $19 as basically $10. I explain how my brain smoothed numbers to make spending feel lighter. The insight comes when I redo the math honestly and see the difference over months. Emotionally, it's uncomfortable realizing how often I participated in my own confusion. I reflect on how I wasn't lying to myself exactly. I was just being generous with the assumptions. I talk about annual costs disguised as monthly comfort, insurance add-ons, warranties, premium features. I break down one example into a yearly number that feels heavier than expected. This is the money reveal moment. Emotionally, there's a pause where I admit I didn't want to look at it that way at first. I reflect on how companies speak in monthly terms because it works, and how willingly I listened. I focus on lifestyle creep that didn't feel like change. Nothing dramatic shifted, but expenses slowly climbed. I talk about raises being absorbed quietly. The insight is realizing that increased income didn't increase breathing room. Emotionally, there's a dull disappointment in how progress felt invisible. I reflect on how I assumed more money would automatically fix the feeling of being stuck, without noticing how fast it vanished. I talk about social spending. Not flashy nights out, just birthdays, group orders, splitting checks. I mention realistic monthly totals. The insight comes from realizing how often I spent to avoid awkwardness. Emotionally, there's discomfort in admitting how expensive politeness can be. I reflect on how I rarely questioned these moments because they felt socially mandatory. I focus on the habit of ignoring statements, bank apps, credit summaries, email notifications. I describe swiping them away without reading. The insight is realizing that ignorance felt peaceful, but it was temporary. Emotionally, there's a sense of quiet dread when I remember finally opening one and feeling behind. I reflect on how avoidance creates the very stress it tries to escape. I talk about small fees, late fees, convenience fees, delivery charges. I list a few real amounts and add them up. The insight comes when I realize how much I paid just to not think. Emotionally, there's irritation at myself more than anyone else. I reflect on how fees felt like background noise until I gave them a number. I focus on the story I told myself. This is just how expensive life is now. I explain how comforting that belief was. The insight comes when I realize it let me stop asking questions. Emotionally, there's a quiet sadness in how quickly I accepted that narrative. I reflect on how naming something as inevitable can feel like relief, even when it's just giving up attention. I talk about budgeting attempts that failed because they felt punitive. I describe apps I downloaded and deleted. The insight is realizing I treated budgeting like punishment instead of curiosity. Emotionally, there's a frustration in how quickly I gave up. I reflect on how resistance often means something is touching a nerve. I focus on the paycheck itself, how it arrived and disappeared on a predictable schedule. I mention exact timing and amounts. The insight comes when I realize I plan my life around depletion instead of accumulation. Emotionally, there's discomfort in how normalized that rhythm became. I reflect on how something can be stable and unhealthy at the same time. I focus on the paycheck itself, how it arrived and disappeared on a predictable schedule. I mention exact timing and amounts. The insight comes when I realize I plan my life around depletion instead of accumulation. Emotionally, there's discomfort in how normalized that rhythm became. I reflect on how something can be stable and unhealthy at the same time. I talk about moments when money stress showed up physically, tight shoulders, short patience, background anxiety. The insight is connecting that feeling to small habits, not big emergencies. Emotionally, there's vulnerability in admitting how much energy it took to maintain normalcy. I reflect on how being fine can still be exhausting. I end with a small, heavy number. I take one daily habit and stretch it across a year, then a decade. I let the math sit without commentary. Emotionally, there's a tired acceptance rather than panic. I reflect on how this behavior didn't ruin my finances overnight. It just kept me exactly where I was. I trail off with the image of checking a balance late at night. Not shocked, just disappointed in how familiar the number looks.